Good day, everyone, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. Really excited that you've joined us. We've got a really fantastic panel and topic. The topic is 5 tips for transitioning from DevOps to DevSecOps. Our webinar today is sponsored by Perforce. Very happy to be working with the folks here from Perforce on our panel. My name is Mitch Ashley. I'll serve as your host and moderator for the webinar. Participate a little bit myself here, I'm sure, in some of the conversation. Just a few housekeeping items. We are recording the webinar, so all participants will receive an email with a link to the recording as well as the slides that we're using today. So sit back, relax. You hear some great things, wonderful. You have the recording to fall back on. You don't have to take detailed notes. We are giving away 4 Amazon $25 gift cards, and we'll be doing that at the end of the panel. Also, all of us love questions. We love to talk. We love to share ideas and exchange ideas. So we'd love to hear your questions. And you can do that at any time during the webinar. You don't have to wait till the end because we'll be fielding some of those questions during our conversation. So please enter those into the GoToWebinar control panel. So let's move on to our topic, 5 tips for transitioning from DevOps to DevSecOps. My pleasure to introduce our panelists for today. First is Steve Howard, who's SCA Specialist and Technical Services Lead with Perforce Software. Next is Jill Britton, who's Director of Compliance, Perforce Software. And third, last but not least, Stuart Foster, who's Product Manager, Clockwork and Helix QAC with Perforce Software. All 3 of you, welcome. It's great to be talking with you today.
Hey Mitch, how you doing?
Thanks, Mitch.
Great. Well, let's do this. Let's move on to our topic, which is the 5 tips about transitioning. But why don't we start out first with just a little bit of a poll. If we can ask our audience to participate with us, we'll share with you the results. Really interested in kind of where you are on your journey, whether you're just getting started, maybe not even started yet, or you're down the path. So if you would take just a minute and briefly respond to the poll, we'd love to hear from you. Great, we've got folks already jumping in with their thoughts. I know it's we always talk about shift left with security, and DevSecOps, a very popular term, and it's evolved quite a bit in its meaning too. So it's always interesting to see where folks are on their journey. Great. We've got some really good responses here. Let me show the results of the poll. See what we think here. Share the results. There we go. All right. So interesting. Partially implemented 40%, DevOps only 37%. So just over a third, and fourth, really looking for ideas, kind of help me get started. So sounds like biggest part of our participants today actually is in partially implemented. So they've started the journey, and most folks, them as well as the 37% are doing DevOps also. So I'm just curious from our panel, any thoughts or comments? Is this you might have expected about this, or are you surprised by any of the results?
Well, it looks like a classic bell curve there, Mitch. So we've got people generally in that middle of the journey, I guess. That's what I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so.
It's good to see that.
Yeah,
it's good to see some people here are joining to look for ideas so they can actually start on their journey. So that's great.
A really good point, because we should have some great questions coming from folks that might help the people that are looking for ideas too. Yeah.
And we got 7% experts, so we better make sure we get this right.
I'll try to shield us from any tough questions from them. I won't. Okay, great. Well, let's move on to our topic. Our first topic that we want to talk about is around culture. We can move ahead to the slide so we can show everybody the question. How do you create this culture of security? One of the things I like to say is there's a very overused saying of security is everyone's job. My experience is when security is everyone's job, then it's really nobody's job, right? Because nobody's really doing it. Seems like that's the practical result. So how do we get real about making security part of our culture? Who wants to jump in there first?
Yeah, well, I'll jump in there, Mitch. So, I mean, I think you're right. It is something that, first of all, we do want to build a culture of caring about the security. So we've got to start by making sure people feel comfortable in sharing information. So we want a collaborative and open community around the team that are sharing the information that they have. That's the most important thing, because you never know who's going to spot the thing that really matters. I guess that's probably fair to say. We don't want to drive things necessarily from feeling like we know best as maybe the project leaders or whatever. We know what we're looking for. This is the list of things you've got to do. It really is down to training our development team, I guess, to be able to spot the kinds of things that could be an issue, and then really to let them go away and evolve to understand what those threat surfaces might be, and where we could see attacks on our application or our system as a whole. So I think for me, that's the most important thing, really empowering the developers themselves, and well, all members of the team, but particularly the developers who really have their fingertips on the system as it's being created, to make sure they know what we can give them as a start, and then go off and really evolve into that role to understand their particular part of the application, or the way the system's interacting with certain interfaces on the outside, the external interfaces, and know what they're looking for in that space, particularly that could impact the overall system. So yeah, for me, it's really about empowering the developers and creating that trust and the bond to begin with, to get them going themselves.
But it has to apply to the whole organization. It's not just the developers, it's the managers, it's the QA, it's everybody has to buy into this and take it forward. It's so important, and there has to be training in place and everything to empower everybody to create this culture and for it to be the norm.
And Jill, how does it compare with, say, in a safety context, from your expertise? I mean, when we have a safety critical system, generally you have a separate chain of management that goes up through the organization to, say, a functional safety manager or a head of QA or whatever it is, that are kind of independently reporting to the board. Is there something similar we would see in kind of the security compliance?
Well, it's one of those things, it probably will evolve into that. You need the person who is going to take the responsibility and ensure that the culture is sort of implemented. So the chances are you are going to get a safety manager, but that shouldn't be the person that does everything. Whereas in the safety environment, you've got, particular guidelines that you follow to actually get a safe environment and a safe development, whereas security, there are so many other ways in.
It's interesting, there's sort of that kind of like quality check. You have to have separation of duties, and sometimes those are helpful things, but also that can create those barriers that us and them, and also not the collaboration or the sharing they would like to have of part of that make that culture you're talking about, a culture of security. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I think to expand on that, normally you would have a bottleneck or silo of a different business unit, like a specific security team that was like the be all end all. But a lot of companies are looking towards bringing the ownership to everybody, in this, in terms of development, to the developers themselves, and embedding a security expert into that team, or providing tools to help enforce or reduce security vulnerabilities as the development process occurs, right? But also outside of that, it's when we speak about culture, it's not associating blame to anybody, right? It's making sure that when you see something, you have the ability to say something, right? You want your teams to be able to, stop, quickly review that issue and fix it. The whole goal of, implementing good security processes in your software development lifecycle is to halt and prevent at least new issues from entering into your code base. It's the goal of stopping mistakes going forward, and then you can, produce rules and tests to stop issues from happening again. And then once you've done that, once you have a good process in terms of it reinforcing itself, you can then start, working on a backlog of security issues that you might start uncovering or want to clean up and improve your security quality, right?
But it's also being aware that new things happen a lot in security. You will get new vulnerabilities coming in, new weaknesses coming in, and being able to incorporate those and be willing to say, well, okay, we didn't know about this one, but we need to look at it now.
Yeah, it's interesting too. You want that shared learning. You want to bring your unique expertise and skills that compliance folks, security folks, software, QA, everybody, as part of that, you share knowledge, but you also learn together. It seems that that's what that culture of security really relies on, right? Not just all of us doing our own individual duties. It's sort of the pipeline stovepipe kind of way.
Kind of leaning in, I guess that's the way they put it, I think, in the manifesto. It's about having everyone leaning in.
Mm-hmm. Making everybody kind of understand and be aware, trained, given the knowledge of what each individual's kind of security impact is within a company or a project, right? It's top to bottom, it's whole organization, as I think Jill said.
What do leaders need to do to help foster that sense of culture of security?
Well, I think that's the point.
Or management, and by the way, I mean anybody in a leadership role.
Yeah, I think they've got to foster that feeling of trust. I think is most important. It's really building the trust of everyone has the opportunity to comment, and that shared knowledge is important. It doesn't matter whether they're right or wrong in any particular case, but being able to speak out and say there's a potential here for a problem, and that is taken seriously.
Yeah, it's the transparency of it all, and then in general, you're still going to want somebody who is kind of a visionary driver, force, voice of security, who helps everybody understand that it's also a part of their responsibilities as well, right? To kind of provide the tools and the vision of how to do it, and then everybody else can be on board because you have that communication, that transparency of being able to do these things.
Yeah, Stuart says it's like that, but the leaders are enabling everybody to actually do this, providing whatever it is it's need, be it a tool or be it training, that they have to be enablers.
That seems like a grassroots effort is good, but really to be successful, it has to be top to bottom in the organization. It has to be supported by everyone.
Yeah, there should be buy-in.
Well, let's move to our next topic. So there's some thoughts on the culture of security. What security requirements, what kinds of standards, what are the best practices really have to be built in to really achieve DevSecOps to get there? Jill, do you want to start?
Yeah, I start. I mean, security requirements, standards, everything. You're coming from a similar sort of basis as you would do for safety. You've got functional standards that you need to follow. I mean, there's an interesting one that all vehicles are going to have to follow security standards. I think it's from 2022 or something like that. That's coming into the sort of the development. So you do have to have standards. If you're developing code, you need coding standards, safety related ones, for example, CERT or the CWE vulnerabilities, and you need to be totally aware when new things are coming in. I think I said before, if there's a new vulnerability coming in, you have to have a process to incorporate that into your development. It has to be there all the time. So you've got standards, you've got coding standards, you've got functional standards, and they provide guidelines, but you need a good process yourself within every organization to incorporate these, to actually use them. The standards won't do it for you, they will help you.
Yeah, it's the tools don't solve all the problems, right? The tool, throwing a tool at it, or the next best tool, or from Perforce or another company, critical ingredient, but it is about how you do the work using those tools, right, Steve?
Yeah, absolutely. The as Jill mentioned, the security space in particular is evolving with, new threats are always being identified. And the really good news is that this stuff's pretty well published. We can learn from shared knowledge. We're already doing that as a community pretty well through things like the Common Vulnerability database and the CWEs we create on the back of that, for example, for some of the meta language descriptions of how these things can occur. So all we need to do, I say all, what we need to do as developers then on the front end of all of this is to process that information and to build it into our learning and our behaviors going forward, which is kind of what Jill was alluding to there, that we need those processes to kind of capture that, make sure we're going forward. And in the terms of the security requirements, I think again it is like the safety space where we're talking about the functional behaviors of the software, making sure we're doing all of that. And we also need to think about the sort of the non-functional requirements, other stuff around this that could be impacting our security as well, and our behaviors about putting the code together, what systems and platforms we're using, and so on, the stuff outside of the kind of the base code that we're writing as well to be aware of.
Yeah, and you also have to think about where these kind of distributed systems may be connecting to one another. They might be in different languages, there might be different pieces of hardware that are communicating with each other for the first time. So their development process may never have even taken security into account, right? And then, yeah.
Well, and think about our environment today, right? I mean, Steve's in an office environment, but other folks are working from home location. They may be quarantined with other family at a place that's not even at their home. So you don't necessarily have the ability to collaborate all in one place, one physical place, and you don't have the physical security that you would have in an office or other kind of setting. So that's part of the environment too, is just assume that it's all distributed and always can be distributed as part of your development, which puts some kind of unique requirements when you're thinking about security as well, because you're not just sitting there yelling with a cube at the next person with a question.
Yeah, I think we're very lucky. Sorry, I think we're very lucky that things have evolved as they had pretty much across software development for the last few years, and that a lot of this was already being centralized and kind of put into cloud systems that we could get to from any laptop, with the right security access, and that was fortunate with what's happened this year.
It is. Just to kind of share a little data here. I won't go into too much detail, but we did some research around the impact of COVID with software developers and how many organizations already had people doing remote development, and frankly, how the rest of the organization started adopting some things like daily stand-up meetings on Zoom, but more cross-functional teams, shorter paths to delivering smaller increments of work. A lot of things that we do in the DevOps world been adopted just in the business world, kind of forced to, because they work really well in a distributed team, especially when we're all distributed. So interesting tidbit there. Well, that's one of the questions I would like to add to this conversation, and I think this will apply throughout, so I'll bring it up here. Jen from our participants in the audience asked the questions: how do you measure the progress of adopting DevSecOps? What are maybe the metrics or the milestones to kind of think about as you progress down that path? Anybody like to take a shot at that? Oh, you're on mute there, Stuart.
Oh, sorry about that. I can speak to it in terms of like when we've rolled out our product Clockwork that we use internally on our own systems. One of the metrics that we track are new defects being introduced into a code base, right? And we want to be able to stop that. So we report on those things over time. We also have, other things we do are actively track, as Steve mentioned, CVEs as it relates to any open source project software that is incorporated in our product, right? And we review those at pretty consistent cadence to make sure that, those aren't being included in our product as well. So, we also have a lot of automation. So we run checks against, new commits, and we gate against new issues being found. Of course, we watch our metrics in terms of our quality metrics, in terms of nightly builds, are all of our unit tests passing. And also we have security tests related to that. There's many different tools we use, and they all have various levels of kind of reporting information that gives you a good yardstick or kind of a baseline as to whether you are, you're doing better or worse. And the goal is always don't do worse, but also don't put new issues in so that you can actually start dealing with, so you can start dealing with the backlog of issues that you have all of a sudden found by, deploying these methodologies and testing tools and security testing tools specifically.
A metric that I heard recently, I thought was really interesting, not one I've used, but is the time to repair, time to fix of a vulnerability. And looking for that to shorten, because sometimes that can be quite long before you get a chance to, and of course, higher severity ones tend to get more attention, but still, some of those can linger quite long periods of time, months, before they get fixed. And if that's built into your cycle, where you're finding them earlier, you're finding them more rapidly, you're going to have vulnerabilities. It's just a fact of life. That potentially should start to shorten as you really get this integrated to DevOps.
It really should. It should. I mean, one of the interesting metrics that comes out is the time to fix and the phase that it was a vulnerability or any sort of defect was found. And obviously, the earlier you find it in the cycle, the less time it takes to fix, because you don't have to rewind and go through everything. So that's a really, really important metric to have, is the number of defects found in each cycle, which part of the cycle. So you can then wind back and go, well, we've got a problem. No, it won't be in development because that's where you start from, but in some sort of test, when it's getting through that test, why is it doing that? And you've got a lot of sort of feedback there and ways of improving the system, because DevOps, DevSecOps, whatever, you're still looking for this continuous improvement. And metrics are there to allow you to do that.
And then you can attach ROI values to those metrics as well, because you can imagine the further down your software development lifecycle phase it's in, right? You're finding issues that are reported by your customers in field. Those are far more expensive to remediate than while a developer is typing it on the desktop or doing a nightly scan. So those things become important, right? So if you've ever had the experience of some type of critical bug occurring in your product, and you understand how many more hours it takes to fix, the time it takes to fix it, the loss of potential sales, revenue, reputation, whatever it might be, you can kind of start calculating what the value is by finding these things sooner than later.
And the other point there as well, Mitch, is of course, so I mean, both Jill and Stuart talked about finding time, essentially, the detection, how quickly we can detect the issue. But there's also if we have got a mature DevOps process where we're doing things very quickly in terms of creating the next, releasable build, that reduces the time that we can actually take, to get the fix out there. So it's the one line of code change. How quickly can we deliver that when we have found something we need to fix?
Great. I think this is a good segue into our next topic, which is how do we promote development of secure software by developers? I don't think there are too many developers out there that wants to write unsecure code that's not intentional, right? Nobody wants to do that. Of course, they want to write secure code. What are the things we can do to aid developers, or maybe more than just developers, but how do we help begin that? Create it right the first time, as early as possible. Who wants to jump in that? I think maybe Stuart, you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. We've talked a little bit about the transparency, the communication, the standards requirements. Well, that all can be brought together in terms of providing, development tools for your developers. You can be thinking about, using traceability software like ALMs. Treating your code carefully and keeping it in repositories, starting to automate stuff through CI/CD processes, ensure that you start leveraging security tools. So there's a lot of different types of application security testing tools there's static application tools, there's dynamic, interactive, you have functional unit test software you can use. You should encourage your developers to be writing unit tests. There's various ways to threat model, and adding into that, being able to understand some of your market vertical requirements, your business requirements for security, and selecting the correct coding standard to use and enforcing that via a static application security testing tool, for example, and amongst all that, getting that continuous feedback and security training and awareness. So it's really taking what we spoke of so far and selecting and developing a development process, and integrating tools so it's easy to do. It's less disruptive for the developer because it's part of their entire kind of workflow pipelines and so forth.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point Stuart makes there, that we've got to make it easy for developers to do the right thing in terms of writing secure software. So that includes obviously providing training and the knowledge that they need, but also if we are going to bring in tools like the SaaS tools that Stuart mentions, if we put that into the CI system so that the developers aren't necessarily impacted by it, immediately, it's not making it difficult for them, it's just built into the system, and it's providing very, very rapid feedback to the issues that are being detected. So we've trained them, that's kind of the carrot piece, we're giving you the training you need to understand and to write the more secure software, but then if we can also put gating into, say, the CI system to make it a comfortable way to kind of report back and feedback to the developers on any issues that we're detecting then later downstream or as soon as possible, obviously, but that's the other side of it, I guess.
Yeah, it has to be easy. That's the point. Anything that's going to make a developer's life more difficult is not going to be accepted. They're going to try and any way possible to avoid it. Speaks one who's already done that. But it is the ease of use, making it seem natural. This is just this is what we do.
And the feedback needs to be timely. Oh, sorry about that, Mitch. But the important part is the feedback needs to be timely. Like, you don't want it to be so far out of context days later that getting back into flow, it's so hard, right? If we have the abilities to give it back as soon as possible, then it's more likely to get done, right?
I think that's a super important point, is if you can lower the barrier to entry, that sort of disruption, if you will, interruption to the flow, and make it easy. I mean, you can't necessarily make it invisible in many cases, but I think the easier you make it for people to step into it, lean into it, as you were using that term earlier, Steve, that makes a big difference. And it certainly sets a tone back to the culture topic of, we're here to tell you what you're doing wrong or to punish you for doing something wrong, to no, this is how this can help you, and I'm going to make it as easy as I can to help you get started or move through it.
And it's important that the developers understand why this process is in place. The security is sort of very much when you're working on your desktop all day long. The security of the big wide world seems a long way away, but it's making sure that the developers understand what the impact of anything that they do is on the product in the end.
Yeah, that's where the feedback and the kind of relevant information really comes in. So if we can detect issues, for example, with the SaaS tools, and immediately feedback, information about what the context of this, why it's a problem, and also even offer training that links to that, then that's a really good way to keep the developers buy-in, if you will.
And I think in terms of the culture of this is that whoever your security lead is, management, they should be able to provide feedback to the developers and have an open communication saying, like, we've seen the quality of our product go up over time. We're seeing less field feedback, which means less issues that we're having to resolve, which saves us money, means we can ship more features, provide more value to our customers, and sell more. So like them hearing that information, which they don't always hear, knowing that the little headache of building a little bit of extra security actually had, you know, X or Y impact on the field. So bring that culture that management should be able to, you know, understand the what they've saved, and inform the development team of that quality level of the changes that they've done.
You know, I think there's some really, just to pause for a moment and kind of capture some things that you all have talked about. Jill, I really love what you mentioned about making it approachable. You know, don't make the task so daunting of how do we make it all secure. Here's steps how we can kind of build up to it, and also the why. Why are we doing this versus the management program of the month? You know, this too shall pass is sort of the they will wait for this one to go. It'll be something else next month. You know, you're really making it. Here's why we're doing it, and maybe how we measure it. What you were talking about, Stuart. And actually, that speaks to one of the questions that we had from our audience also was, how do you demonstrate the benefit of adopting DevSecOps? And we've talked about some of those things there. Hopefully, I kind of listed a few that you've mentioned. Any other thoughts on that questions? If you were going to say, hey, we're doing all of this, here's why we're doing it, here's how do we show the benefit of doing it, adopting DevSecOps?
Yeah, I think it comes down to some of those ROI kind of descriptors that I was giving there. You know, it's understanding what the cost of, you know, remediating a bug that is found closer towards your release when you have to scramble and try to fix it. Because obviously, as a developer is typing code, being able to type it securely right away, it has a far lesser cost. You know, there's some reports that kind of tag remediating issues later at the final development lifecycle, right before releasing, or resolving issues in the field can cost 10 to 30 times more than simply the developer writing the code right on, you know, from day one. You have to think about the impacts of, you know, if you did have a data breach, how much is that going to cost you in terms of various factors, reputation? Are you going to get sued for, you know, leaking a very sensitive, important data because, you know, you may be a customer dealing with, you know, HIPAA requirements, or you may have financial requirements for PCI, PA, DSS, and things like that. You might be worried about a car crashing. Okay, so there's a lot of things to think about. Also, you know, think about, have you ever had a bug that's taken down your live web services? How much revenue or business are you losing while it's down, and what's the cost to get it back up, right? So there's a lot of factors. They're all going to be different depending on the type of product, the type of service, the type of market vertical that you're existing in, but they all have an intrinsic calculatable value based on, you know, any issues you've seen in the past, or what's a potential issue that's come up, or look at your competitors crashing planes or something like that, right? So there's precedence for understanding what that value is. Not just in developer bug remediation timeframe, but also when the product's in field. How do you fix an embedded system? How do you update the software if it's, you know, buried in some sort of controller maintaining an industrial system?
I mean, I think one Stuart's mentioned there, reputation is extremely valuable. And I think right from the developers, if there's a pride in your product, destroying your reputation by having to do, for example, with an automotive application, having to do a recall, you're in the press. Your reputation is damaged. There is tarnished, and people say, "Oh, you really work for them? Oh, is it your fault?" You get that a lot, and it is reputation is everything in this kind of world.
Now, just to put a little even broader context on this, if you think about software has really come out of the back office just to run the business. It's part of strategies about digital transformation in economic recovery. You know, many companies are saying we're not a airline company, we're a software company, or we're not this company, because it's that important. So hopefully in that elevation of software as an importance to the business. It's going to be able to help you identify what you're doing, whether it's security or new capabilities, to kind of connect the dots to here's why it's making a difference. Number of days since the last security vulnerability in production, if you think of it in safety terms, almost that kind of thing. You should be able to connect the dots all the way almost to the end product of the customers you're using. So it's a great time to be able to answer that question, I think, as opposed to we're just kind of working down in the steam room, engine room, keeping things running. Well, we're doing that too. We're doing a lot more, right? Well, good. Let's jump to our next topic, which I have a funny feeling will be a really enjoyable one for you all, given we're doing that tool and with the Perforce software team. So what types of security tools need to be incorporated into the DevOps tool chains? I know we've talked a lot about a different tools. Maybe, Steve, if you can kind of flow for us from the left end of the tool chain forward, what that might look like. You don't have to have an exact order, but kind of give us an idea of what that picture might look like.
Yeah, so for the first thing, obviously, one of the very quick wins for putting into our DevSecOps pipelines, if you will, is static analysis or static application security testing, as it's often called, SAST tools. So what this gives us is a very quick way, following our coding, essentially, to be able to actually see defects that we can detect from patterns in the code. So that's really where static analysis can bring great value, because it will very quickly pull out control flows and particular coding structures themselves that will either be vulnerable or are vulnerable, known to a certain attack type or whatever within our code base. So that's really the first step, I guess, of going along that process. And obviously that's where some of the Perforce tools, Clockwork and Helix QAC, will operate in different market sectors and so on. So that's really our piece and something we know particularly well. And also with that, there's not only the kind of the common rules and things that we know are a typical vulnerability in C or C++ or Java or whatever it might be in the actual language constructs themselves, but there are also cases where I think, as Stuart mentioned in the early part of this discussion, we can actually feed back into that checking other things that we've detected. So we can sometimes find vulnerabilities from other forms of testing, or from worst case, obviously something that's discovered by a customer or in the field. We can actually feed that back in as kind of an additional rule, if you will, into these SAST platforms to detect those specific issues for our particular type of application or our particular project code itself, or the way that it's working with a given platform underneath. So yeah, that's really where we start with things at the left end of that spectrum.
Connecting the dots to some things we were saying earlier about the approachability of it. How big of a lift? What kind of an effort does it take to get started there? Is it sort of install this tool, turn on a switch, that easy? Or I imagine there's a little bit of a process to go through to kind of really begin to absorb and consume what's coming from a testing tool for security.
Well, yeah, it's pretty low cost of adoption with SAST tools in particular, because they will literally build into an environment pretty quickly and detect what's what your compiler and linker are doing as they're building the code, or whatever other build tools you've got in that chain, and then start to apply those rules. I mean, obviously you have to configure it to sort of check the rules you want, but there's often, as I'm sure Jill will attest in a moment, sort of security coding standards out there that we can actually choose to enforce to a lesser or greater extent, depending on what kind of attack you expect and the level of security required. So yeah, it's a pretty low cost of adoption, but maybe Jill could fill out a little bit more with respect to the kind of the coding guidelines.
Yeah, say we mentioned earlier, there's coding guidelines like CERT, which covers C, C++, Java, and it's a combination of experience and academic review of the possibilities. What if? The whole thing is what if? What if I did this? Would it break it? Yes, it will. Okay, tell somebody. And a good tool will take that and analyze the code, report back. And within your tool chain, you have to go, okay, do I sort this one now? Do I not? And it's a case of looking at what's first. Let's look at the most serious ones. All the coding guidelines categorize the rules. So you get to know which ones are the most dangerous. Let's put dangerous for security, of course. Down to the ones where, okay, if it goes through, it's going to be a little bit difficult. It's not going to cause a major problem. So you've got the categorization, and within the tools, you can switch the rules on, you can switch them off. And as long as you are confident that you are going to get a good level of coverage with the tools, that's where you go. And then as your processing sort of matures, then you come down to the less severe violations, vulnerabilities, whatever, and then look at those. So say you have search, you have CWE vulnerabilities within the SAS tools. You can actually detect if you have got those vulnerabilities occurring. Within Java, you've got the OWASP. I think there's 10 of those. There are many ones, and it's a case of what is appropriate to your particular product and it could be your supplier's requirements.
Let me, I'm going to push pause on one of the, we're not doing a commercial for Perforce and your products, but let me push pause on that and just ask one of you, tell us a little bit about where your products fit into the tool chain, the pipeline process. If you could just give us a quick window into that, and then I'll unpause and we'll just talk about the topics. Anybody want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, I shall. Yeah, why not? Yeah, so with our tools, Clockwork and Helix QAC, they are static analysis tools, so they sit right there. That's the point. The first thing, typically, because it's the quickest and the cheapest thing to run after your compilation phase or whatever you're building of the code, they tend to sit right there in the tool processes. So it's up front. Obviously, if we detect something in the static analysis, it might not be worth going on to other forms of more costly testing, because we can probably say we've already got an issue here, so there's no point running that. Let's save that time and money and roll things back at that point, or as Jill was saying, we actually block our branch from proceeding further until those issues are resolved. Once those are resolved, then we push it further down the pipeline. So that's really where we're sitting, yes, right at that far left of the pipeline, if you will, for DevSecOps.
Wonderful, brilliant. Okay, I'll push pause on that again. Jill, I'm curious, is there anything you might add to the auditing, the compliance side of this? Because there's a lot of data that we are capturing, maybe we're not necessarily using in our tool chain, about how much scanning, where we're doing scanning, what coverage we're getting, that might be useful for later compliance activities, security audits, things like that. What's your experience with how tools can help you with some of that data?
Well, tools can usually produce a report of what's been run, when it's been run, who ran it for that matter, and within coding standards, for example, which rules were enabled, which ones were disabled, and of the ones that were enabled, how many violations were found, and any particular files, for example, that had many violations, that one should be absolutely shown in red and pulled back. And you can also, within the tools, you can have metrics, you can have over time. So you can see, as Stuart mentioned, the time, how the metrics have improved over time. Take one that everybody knows about, which is cyclomatic complexity. You can see if your cyclomatic complexity is improving over time, and the tool can give you that sort of information, and that is always good for an audit. You can see continuous improvement, you can see the state of the software at any time, And it also allows, if you've got third-party software coming in, you can see if there have been any additional violations added. You can see how if it has improved or if it's just stayed exactly the same, and in that case, what's been going on there. There is an awful lot of data, as you say, that can be extracted using tools.
Definitely an area to not overlook. Super valuable. Help you get through that process faster.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's move on to our next topic. We're going to start with a poll first, though. If we could ask everyone to join in and help us, what do you see as the biggest challenge in being successful with DevSecOps for you or your organization? Sort of kind of following along some of the topics that we're talking about culture, about operations, development, of course, tools, et cetera. We'll be talking about continuous security, but also compliance here in a moment. So if we could ask our audience to join in with us and share their thoughts of where you see some of your biggest challenges for being successful with DevSecOps. Great, we're getting some great responses here. I feel like you should play a little bit of Jeopardy music and do the game show hosting thing. I'm not nearly that talented, but I think we've got a pretty good response here. So I'm going to close the poll in, let's say, 3, 2, 1. Great. Let's share those results. Interesting. Interesting. Culture of security. Culture is always a challenge, right? Especially changing a culture. Operations. I'm interested that that's second on the list. What are your all reactions to the responses? Anybody want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. So certainly I would say the culture of security doesn't surprise me because it's probably one of the softer, I guess, less obvious, less tangible ones that we mention here. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense, first and foremost, I guess. It's good to see the tools and collaboration piece and the compliance is pretty low. It's as a challenge. So it's good to know we've kind of got a handle on that piece, which is interesting, Mitch.
The cultures are hard to change, no doubt. They're very much kind of part of the DNA of the organization. So I agree with you. Anybody else have a comment before we move on? Okay, great. Well, let's move to our next question here. What are some of the common pitfalls when transitioning to DevSecOps? Right along with our question that we were just asking, some of the challenges that folks might have in that transition. Stuart, do you want to start out with this one?
Sure. I think to start, a little bit per the operations comment, that's where you're talking about understanding, what your product requirements are, what your potential risks are, and selecting a coding standard. And then, even once you've done that, what happens when you start going through your code or using a tool and you start seeing all these vulnerabilities? Well, one of the main pitfalls is when starting out is trying to resolve all those issues or vulnerabilities immediately, right? Instead of what's probably more important, try to generally say, you kind of in many ways already know the quality of your product as it is. So really what it becomes starting these operations, starting this culture is saying the point of this is to halt new vulnerabilities from being introduced, right? That's where you want to start. You got to get over the overwhelming part of, oh, there's so much we can fix. The best place to start is just stop new ones from coming in, right? That means your quality is going to be set where it currently is. And then you can start making improvements, iterative improvements. And what do you do then? You follow it up by, looking at issues, looking at field feedback, bugs that customers may have found, trying to understand those types of vulnerabilities, what they are, and relating them back to, the coding standards or vulnerability types that you're looking for, right? And that will help you prioritize. And then you can start remediating, those existing or lingering issues in your code and rolling it out over time, right? Some other pitfalls when you're, including more automation, more intricacies in terms of dealing with your security issues is it relates right back to the halting new vulnerabilities. It's not gating your CI commits, your code commits. They should fail to merge if there's any issues, and it should push back going back to communication and transparency, it should report back as fast as possible to the developer that no, we can't put this code in. There's some vulnerabilities that need to be dealt with right now. And that's their opportunity to either resolve them or at least justify kind of deferring them to later before they resubmit. Because, you know, it may be a case that they don't consider it necessarily an issue because perhaps they don't have enough training or knowledge to understand why. Well, then in the process of them deferring that issue, you can then send it to a more security expert who can then take the time to review it and then reassess and reprioritize and reassign it back if it needs to be fixed, right? In terms of further kind of implementation, kind of common pitfalls is, I'll call it cutting corners. You know, it's imposing a culture. So it goes a little bit back to the culture of security that had another high kind of bar there. You can't impose the culture. You need to make it easy to embrace. So we talked about, you know, setting up ease of use. I would call that, you know, maybe setting up natural checks and balances within your existing kind of corporate and development processes. So being able to seamlessly integrate, have automated checks, have the ability to produce reports that are not just understandable for development, but for management. So you're going to want to look at taking whatever metrics that you can develop or your tools can provide and produce some sort of like quality dashboard that helps show, you know, that we are stopping new issues from coming in and we are remediating and resolving the issues over time in the backlog. And then, you know, ideally, you know, managers or corporate leaders can attach that value to you know, issues that may have cost money, reputation in the market, and then feed that information back to the development team to say that, you know, you made this impact, so that everybody is just aware of what's going on. It's not just development doing a loop. Imagine the infinity loop throughout the entire organization, right? And I think those are some of the common pitfalls that we see when starting as it relates to that culture of security and the security operation. I think it seems that a lot of the people here from the polls, they understand the use of the tools and they understand the collaboration, but it's tying that tool into the holistic kind of transparency, communication world of doing this.
Joe, you have a wealth of experience in software development, compliance, et cetera. What are your thoughts on some common pitfalls?
Well, it's always taking you back to the culture. One of the pitfalls here is saying you are now the security manager. You are going to sort this out for us, and it is, as we've said over and over again, it's embracing the whole of the organization into this security aspect, not just saying you are the security manager, you must deal with it. And that is probably the most common pitfall.
I guess to give a real life example of what we do, you know, I'm obviously the product manager, and I work with my dev teams, and I try to reinforce the value of, you know, dealing with these issues. So, you know, what we've done is, I think I mentioned earlier, looking at open source software that we include, we set up an automation check that often goes and checks the National Vulnerability Database and reports back if there's new vulnerabilities as it relates to our OSS projects. We have a couple of people in various development teams that it's all reported into a Slack channel. The developers see it, right? And there's a bunch of us in there. And then when it comes time to planning, you know, a release, I have a set percentage of, you know, our workflow, our throughput that is dedicated to security. So like it has to be top down. It has to be throughout the organization. So you need each individual kind of to understand what their role is, what they should be doing to improve security, and then enforce it and really share it to the team. So those are kind of that's kind of like a real life example of how we try to treat one aspect of that piece of security when we develop and plan.
Yeah, it's important because it's shared, isn't it? You've got the Slack channel. It isn't one person going, okay, we're doing security. Yeah, let's get up this morning and do security. Yesterday we did safety, so tomorrow we'll do security. It isn't like that. It can't be, and that is a starting point for this new culture.
Well, let's go to our last question, and I'm sure Steve, you might have some things to add too on the topic of those common pitfalls. But we've been evolving to this place of really how do we get to a point of continuous security, right? Just like we have continuous deployment and integration, really making that feedback loop that you talked about.
Yeah.
I'd love to get your thoughts on sort of how do you make this just part of what you do? And it's an ongoing, it's built in, but it's also something you continuously improve at as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The continuous improvement to this process is, on top of the original automation. So of course, as you'd expect with DevOps in general, the idea is the automation drives things continuously. So we're doing something all of the time. With every single commit, we are checking to see if we have security vulnerabilities from a SaaS point of view or a DAS point of view, or whatever we're doing after. We've got continuous monitoring of systems that are live systems, and obviously looking for interactive security in those cases as well. So yeah, that's kind of one piece of this. But as you really correctly say there, it's also about continuous improvement in that process. So making sure we're passing back the information of what things we found and how we can then move that further into to the left, perhaps by actually enforcing certain rules in a SaaS environment from something we discovered in an IAST perspective. So we've actually found an issue where something was being attacked and dealt with it, but then we can actually enforce a more robust system from day one if we do this. And it's really just getting that information back to our developers and the security teams around them.
Excellent. Jill, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too.
Well, it's pretty much as Steve says, you mustn't move to the next stage without sort of reviewing anything that is going to break the system. Is it good enough to move forward? And we sort of just got to have the processes in place. They don't have to be very, very strict. You will do this, but there has to be this understanding of why we're doing something and what we need to do and how we measure it, that we can actually see that we're getting this continuous security, continuous improvement, both in the process and in the software itself.
Excellent advice. Stuart, you can help us kind of put a bow on this. What are your thoughts?
I'll just be summarizing what they said. But yeah, it's automation, it's reporting, it's remediation, it's all that transparency to every person. Having dashboards available, having some type of compliance operation over, checklists, or at least set up a checklist, and ensure that you improve that checklist whenever something comes up that's new and add it to the process. That the point is every time you hit a stumbling block, you should be adding a new automated, a new check, a new process to ensure that it doesn't happen again. And it just will continuously feed back into itself.
Very good. And if I can just add one thing, I would say kind of going back to the why that we talked earlier, always be asking yourself, now what was the why? And are we still in line with that? Or maybe it's time to ask if the why has changed, because it does change. That always brings it back to making, why are we doing this? This is important. Okay, good. All right, we know what the benefits are that we're hoping for. So hopefully that complements what you all have said. Well, it's been a fantastic panel. I feel privileged to have been part of it and learn from you all and all the expertise that you have from your own experiences, both building software and working with your customers. So all I can say is thank you to you, Jill, Steve, Stuart, for fantastic contributions and being so transparent, sharing your expertise and knowledge. Let's move to closing the program here. I do want to announce who our winners of the gift cards are. We have 4 winners: David L., Juan V., Kurt M., and Sherry J. The folks here at MediaOps, DevOps.com we'll be in contact with you about getting a hold of your gift cards. Great time of the year to have a little bit of extra spending money. Well, we appreciate your time together with us today. You know, and we're so much busier during this kind of COVID era, if you want to think of it that way. You know, we're all working really hard, a lot of hours. The fact that you would spend an hour of your time with us, we're extremely honored and privileged, and we thank you for doing that. We wish you the best. So be sure to check out DevOps.com. We've got other great content. I put in a couple links into the messages. You can see some other videos that we've had some other conversations that might be able to pick up a few things on. So on behalf of the whole team here, I'd like to thank our production team, Jade and Jody, for working with us to help put this together, and all of you. So be safe, be careful, be well. We'll see you soon.
Bye.